Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Catherine Marshall again, and today we are winding up what has been a very exciting week, focused on major issues facing the global community as we move towards the summit for the G20, and before that, the G20 Interfaith Forum, which will take place in October. As a quick reminder, we started on Monday with a discussion and presentations on major issues. The recording, the video for that is available now on the Berkeley Center website, as are the biographies of people here. And we are recording this session as well. We will today be hearing first from Mohammed Abu-Nimer from CAICID, one of the co-organizers, and from Cole Durham, who is the president of the G20 Interfaith Association, and then hear from each of the three working groups that met on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday for 2 hours each. With the end of today, where we have an hour session, that will conclude the North America regional consultation for the G20, and you will be hearing about what happens next. So with that, let me turn to Mohammed Abu-Nimer.
I should unmute. Thank you, Catherine. Can you hear me? Is it clear? Thank you. Thank you again for the introduction. Thanks again for inviting us and bringing us all back into this room as well. I wanted to, in this brief closing remarks, I wanted to. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time with my camera. Just give me 1 second. I'm good now. Wanted to offer my appreciation on behalf of CAICID and acknowledgement for the invested energy and willingness to invest for everyone their time and thoughts into this week and to contribute to the North American regional meeting. I think this is our, I think, sixth group, and it's exciting to see so many faces and so many people that we already work with and also familiar with, and it's great to be part of this. This is an important regional meeting, not only because of the number of G20 countries in the North America region, but also because of the weight that this region has in shaping many of the global policies and many issues as well. I mean, obviously the topic is important, all the topics is important, but I wanted to highlight the relevancy and intentionality in identifying race, racial division in many ways, that the US, in particular, United States of America, was part of this global movement on it. And I think this is something very important that this regional meeting chose and pursued. I think it's an important region, and I would have wished that it was done also in other region as well. I mean, obviously, despite the COVID-19 reality, we have been in many global initiatives and campaigns on the race issue, and I hope we will manage to put the input from this region into the group. Just a quick reminder, my second point, I have 5 points. This is second one. Reminder that this annual exercise of the G20 Interfaith is a cumulative process of a change. It does not end with the list of recommendations to be submitted. In fact, I think it is only very small part of the process. This process have number of important aspects for me and for us being involved in. One is that it's nurturing and protecting the space for conversation among ourselves. And here I refer to religious leaders and FBOs, as well those who I'd call them sympathetic policymakers to the voice of faith and religion. The second, we build a positive habit of communicating faith-based organization and religious leader views on a global agenda and issues. And that does not happen very often. The third, we establish a clear norm and the standard for faith-based and religious leader and policymaker to engage on a specific issue. And that, again, that space is really very much missing in the international and the global arena, and even more in the national arena in many parts of the world. Number four, we sensitizing policymakers to the importance of delinking religion from stereotypes and misperception that religion is exclusively the cause of violence, exclusively the cause of exclusion, and even backwardness, I have heard sometimes. Another benefit of the G20 Interfaith, why we're doing this, is building a strong foundation for articulating faith-based organization and religious leader perspective on this global level. We do not have database archive, but now, having done this for 4, 5, 6 years, I think we're building this important archive to do this. So third point, we really need to be patient and persistent in making our points direct and clear to the policymaker. Even if we do not immediately see the results, we know from this line of work, peace building, social change, interfaith, that the shift or such shift in perception and policies require even, I dare to say, more than one generation for good constructive engagement. And my fourth point, really very simple, has to do with we need to continue in these efforts of engaging policymaker who has become even more clear and having more participated in the 5 regional. I've noticed that from Africa to the Arab region, to the European, and now to the American, and to the also Latin American, the one in Argentina, we all globally as actors across faith community struggle with articulating the clear objectives, the clear messages, concrete messages and recommendation. Everyone struggle with that. Second, we really struggle from often circulating within the same group of faith follower and professional follower, I call them. So we tend to see the input limited to those who share similar perspective. We avoid the political and controversial topics that have ideological polarization, and we tend to look at the language of harmony and peace. And that discourse is certainly unifying and make us feel good, but it really also tends to prevent such groups from confronting the current and painful issues. I noticed that even on the issue of race in the US, or on the issue of other environment, a number of issues that we've discussed in the different region. The asymmetric power relation is another challenge we have with the faith-based organization and religious leader. When we speak to policy in the policy circle that dictates and shape the influence of the engagement, our engagement is in a way religious voice tend to appeal from below to those who are higher and seen as higher. I've seen so many religious leaders speaking from this in many ways weaker point, except of course those who take the prophetic tone or the mandate. And finally here, the religious and FPO's institution, that's clear across all region, and I think in a number of ways also in the US was clear, or in the North region, North America region, including Argentina. The religious and faith-based organization institution have little resources invested in the policy engagement process. It doesn't mean they do not have the resources. It means that intentionally or unintentionally, or most likely intentionally in such a scale, they do not put as much, or we do not put as much resources into it. And this means that our engagement with it is really in a crisis mode operation. When something wrong happens, we in the faith-based community jump and say, here is what we think about it, as opposed to more systematic and long-term. I will stop here and say, these are some of the points that I've seen also in North America, but most of all, I wanted to thank Catherine and the Berkeley Center for pulling us all together throughout those 4 days, and for making this space possible to generate such a rich discussion. Thank you, Catherine. Back to you.
And thank you, Mohammed. And let's turn now immediately to Cole Durham.
Well, thank you, Mohammed. I want to underscore what you've just said and certainly emphasize that I agree with those points. I thought they were very thoughtful and very helpful. I want to echo a word of thanksgiving to our partners, to the G20 Interfaith Forum, as we prepare for the G20 Interfaith Forum in Saudi Arabia, partners notably CAICID, the UN Alliance of Civilizations, the National Committee for Interfaith and Intercultural Dialogue in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And of course, we owe particular thanks to Catherine Marshall, the Berkeley Center, who is hosting this event, and for the great team that is working with her and making this possible for us all. I think this has been an impressive week, as we expected it to be. The North America, as Mohammed just said, has a particular weight in the G20 process, and there is a lot of expertise that is gathered in this area. So I think this has been a particularly fruitful area, and I think the topics chosen, the refugees, the COVID crisis itself, and racism, have been really fruitful things to think about. In each of these, we were able to raise a number of issues that deserve further focus, and the challenge will be taking the ideas we have discussed to the next level. And I'd say that in two ways. First, as a practical matter, we will be working to develop over the next month some more focused policy recommendations in each of these areas. I think our discussions here have been extremely helpful in identifying areas of focus that we need to work with. And second, I am increasingly convinced that in addition to coming up with recommendations that can be passed on to global leaders at the level of the G20 summit, one of the most important things that happens in this process is bringing, I like the phrase, the friendly policymakers, religion-friendly policymakers, other experts together, but people who really understand the magnitude of those who are involved with religion and the number of the kind of insights that they can bring, and also the on-the-ground ability to do things. And I think part of this process forces us to come together to think of ways we can work together in harmony, but also to think about some of the harder issues. So I think we need to think more about those kinds of things. I think I should let everyone know that details are emerging. As many of you would know, we've been wrestling and uncertain whether we would be able to hold a physical meeting in Riyadh or whether this would be online. We learned conclusively today that it's going to be online. And that, of course, has advantages, disadvantages. Just for your calendars, this will now happen over 5 days, beginning Tuesday, October 13th, and continuing for 5 days with the final session on Saturday, October 17th. There will be plenary sessions each day, scheduled as at this point at 4 p.m. Saudi Arabian time, which is 8 a.m. in the morning on each day, Washington time. A little harder for me in Utah, where it's 6 a.m., but we'll live with that. But this, given how global this is, that time frame will make it possible to reach most time zones in the world. The plenary sessions will be followed each day by 2 or 3 focused working groups. We already have a list of very distinguished experts. We anticipate that we're going to be able to start posting this in much more detail on our website, g20interfaith.org, during the coming days. This is as these things do, still coming together, but we anticipate that that will be up and available very soon. We have acceptances from an array of very distinguished speakers, so we can assure you that this will be a very high-level event. I have to say, looking at the regional meetings, we've learned a great deal this year. The first is that it's possible for us to reach and communicate with a much larger number of people than ever before using some of the online mechanisms. There are, of course, trade-offs, uh, but we've learned some important things. Second thing is that there are a number of issues where the G20 Interfaith Forum can make longer-term contributions. In the past, we have tended to focus on one major event each year, coordinated with and preceding the G20 Interfaith Summit, or the G20 Summit itself. But I think we've learned, and we have now established 10 working groups that are correlated with the SDGs. Some of the working groups, like the environmental one, for example, covers several of the SDGs. But this means that we anticipate in coming months that we will have working groups that will be conducting ongoing work to carry on initiatives on several of the important focal issues, such as the ones we've discussed here. Refugees is certainly one of them. Hopefully the COVID issue will go away, but health will remain as a priority issue. And there are several others. We hope that many of you will be interested in following what's going on, and we'll link up with these working groups on a more permanent basis. If you're interested, you can communicate immediately with our secretariat at secretariat@g20interfaith.org. And in the coming days, we will also have information for each of the working groups, how you can communicate with those. I think that just looking back on this week, I'm conscious that we've seen some very helpful kinds of things. I think in particular of a couple of issues. Certainly the racism initiative, and maybe that's the one that I should just focus on and draw your attention to. This was interesting because it allowed some interaction between our working group structures and thinking about the larger issue of racism. And I think it was important to see this as something that's not just one issue among others, but as an issue that affects all areas of our work. This was symbolically evident in the structure of the meeting on Thursday, because we had people from several of the working groups commenting on how racism affects each of those areas. But I think that more than that, that will contribute, among other things, to a statement that's being formulated and will be, I think, finalized in the coming week. It will be up on our website. But this is an example of two things. It's an example of the way we've been able to move quickly to realize a really current critical issue, to take it forward, and to link it up with some of the other work that we've been doing. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to do across the board in many areas. Let me stop there. I want to congratulate and thank everyone who's been involved this week. I think it's been very helpful, and I look forward to carrying forward the various recommendations and ideas that have come out of this week. Thanks to all.
Thank you very much, Cole. And we'll come back at the end on exactly what's going to happen next, what the next steps are. My colleague David Hollenbach, who is immersed in the refugee issues, could not be with us today, nor could he join the working group. So I'm going to give a very brief summary of some of the issues on the refugee challenge, and then go on to the other two topics. David Hollenbach emphasizes, whenever he discusses the issue of refugees, the the depth of the theological commitments that are behind the very broad concern of religious communities historically, but also very much today, with the plight of both refugees, and we need to emphasize very strongly the internally displaced peoples who are so often neglected in the discussions about refugees. So that first point is the moral issue, which also came up as a contrast to the interests that drive the G20 powers and others as they reflect on the challenges for refugees. In other words, does one focus on the potential for serious harm if refugee issues are neglected, for security, on drain on the economy, or does one focus on these basic issues of humanity and responsibility that we see as so vital? So I think this balancing of these deeply felt, deeply studied, deeply articulated principles that underlie focus on refugee issues with the very pragmatic issues that go behind funding decisions and other allocations. A second issue that came up in many settings was the focus on children. The importance of keeping an eye on children, whether it's at the southern border of the United States, but also in other parts of the world, that this is one of the great tragedies of the enormous numbers, the 80 million people who are in forced migration situations today. A third point that came up very strongly was this sense of urgency, that even in the midst of the COVID crisis, which in many ways is making the refugee situation worse for many different reasons, the physical constraints, the restrictions on funding, the weakness of efforts to address the underlying problems, that this is an urgent issue described by some as a time bomb. And this applies in North America very much on the southern border, in Central America, where people are coming to the United States or seeking to do so, but also some of the communities within the United States where the attention has been lost. And this comes to the sharp drop in the numbers of refugees resettled in the United States in recent years, and the lost opportunities, the lost mercy, the lost care that represents. There even were highlighted some of the issues of the prosecution of people trying to serve refugees on humanitarian grounds and on what that tells us. On the faith, so what's faith got to do with it, which is always the question that we're looking at. It comes in many diverse ways. It comes with this moral understanding, raising the priority of refugee issues on the agendas, trying to find better means to support internally displaced populations. That is a commonly shared moral obligation, a duty, a responsibility for compassion and care, as well as attention to basic standards, including human rights standards. Private communities are involved in many ways: churches, organizations, Jesuit refugee services, many others. But also governments are critically important. And I think this brought us very much to the issue of what is behind the causes of the increases and the persistence of these refugee challenges, that Many refugees have spent a full generation in limbo, in refugee camps, in internally displaced situations, because the basic causes that have led them to flee have not been resolved. And we were reminded quite often that people do not flee lightly, that it's only when facing the mouth of the shark that people will move away. So we focused on the many confluences of interests and the confluences of opportunities that the refugee challenge represents. We'll be circulating to those who are interested, and we'll be trying to elicit specific comments from many of you, a brief that also highlights the framing of recommendations to the G20 leaders when they meet in November. And many of these thoughts and ideas are echoed in the other regional meetings, but also in the broad overview. And one of the striking things about the discussion of refugee issues was that it kept straying across the world, that it was not simply confined to North America, with, I think, a very deep recognition that these are human challenges, but they are also challenges that face all nations, no matter what their borders are, and that finding collective common solutions, both to these issues of values and norms, but also to the practical side, is immensely important. So with that, I will turn over to Olivia Wilkinson, who was leading and focusing on the group that dealt with the implications of the COVID-19 crisis. Olivia.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Hello, everyone. My name is Olivia Wilkinson. I'm the Director of Research at the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities. And with Ruth Messenger this week, Ambassador at AJWS, we've been leading some of the discussion on faith and COVID. So in the working group session we had on Wednesday, we had quite a lively discussion. I want to thank everyone that participated, and of course extending my thanks to Catherine and Ruth and everyone at the Berkeley Center who've been organizing the process this week. So I'm going to try to give an overview of what we talked about and what we collectively thought we should take forward. It's been quite a challenge to bring some of these threads together, but I hope I can do some justice to it. I'd like to start with something actually I'm borrowing from Mohammed El-Sanusi, who really summed up some points about what religious communities have been doing to respond to COVID. And he stated that religious communities have experience, that they're innovative, and that they're collaborative. And that we saw later on in the discussion as well that in fact, many religious communities, although we do hear stories of those outliers who are not following public health rules and restrictions and recommendations at the moment, that we must have an awareness that most faith communities are going along with these recommendations and providing what we might call essential services to many of the communities around them. So going into this point on social services, we saw quite a lot of discussion around that. Reverend Leah Daughtry said, faith communities are stepping into a gap that the government has left around these provisions of social services. A lot of the work that religious communities are undertaking include meals, providing meals, food banks, for example, or arranging PPE supplies, amongst a range of other services. And some of the services that also came up are the rights of clergy to visit people in hospitals, conduct funeral services, and the spiritual services and pastoral services that surround religious communities' work. A question that came up was, what is an essential service? And should some of this social capital that exists amongst faith communities count as an essential service? We see the affirmation or reaffirmation of religious communities as social services becoming one of the major points of discussion amongst our reflections on the work of religious communities in the COVID response. Then we also saw there's some discussion about how to work with religious leaders in various ways. So there was an acknowledgement that sometimes there are that religious leaders can be a very useful conduit for messaging, public health messaging, but there can be a lack of information or misinformation happening with certain groups. There have been many technological challenges, but also many technological innovations amongst religious communities to help the flow of communication with congregations and with communities. And there's been a recognition that young people within religious communities are stepping up to help overcome some of those digital divides as well. With religious leaders, we saw some discussion around the burden that has been placed on people in these leadership roles to really come forward, provide these services, provide the pastoral support, as I was saying. So there's a mental health burden on religious leaders who have, as one of our participants said, the caregivers have not been cared for. And this is not only people specifically in leadership positions, but also the volunteers in religious communities that have been giving of their time to provide for those around them. And so that could become a real, well, it already is a burden, but become a real long-term issue as the response to the virus extends over months and potentially years. I think what we saw was that, again, just reiterating the statement that I said on Monday, that religious community response is not homogenous in any way. We see vast differences, and it's also reflected and connected to inequalities, inequities that we see in society, as well as those religious communities are connected to the other inequities and marginalizations that might affect them. So those living in poor, in cramped conditions, for example, will have a very different experience than religious communities that are affiliated with other elements of class and divisions in societies. We also have the reality that there are going to just be different responses depending on where religious communities are located and how the virus is affecting them in those locations as well. I think one of the things that came out very, very prominently is the connection to government engagement, but also trust in government, the general relationship of the society and religious communities' place in society, their trust and understanding of government. So we had some vastly different responses from countries like Canada and New Zealand, where there seemed to be a large, we can't of course say complete, but more or less a trust in what the government is, the decisions that are being made for the public health of the citizens in the country, and a general agreement to follow and adopt amongst the religious communities and society widely a lot of the provisions that are in place. And then, of course, there are other countries where that is particularly not the case, and polarization, politicization of issues is very present, increasing, modulating over time. I would like to again bring up, we discussed this on Wednesday, but Talia Kaplan said that it's impossible to separate COVID response from a healthy democracy. And I thought that was just a really good kind of snippet, a statement of information that really summed up a lot of what we were talking about. So we have this idea of healthy democracy, citizen engagement, the roles of religious communities, but then we also zoomed in very specifically on how governments have been engaging with faith actors in their response. And so there's a clear statement from the group in many ways that respective governments should bring faith actors into the mix, into the discussion, and help faith actors be at the table. when policy public health decisions are being made, because it's such a crucial portion of society and the influence that can be connected with faith actors. However, I think there was an appreciation that government is very varied. So, for example, in some countries, some departments are better than others at faith engagement, that there should be support of those faith actors that are engaged with government to help those faith actors that are not, or are marginalized or unrecognized by government, also come to the table. Some governments have monthly meetings with faith actors. Some governments do have none. There was also recognition that there had perhaps been an initial rush to faith actor engagement amongst the public health response that then faded over time, so that we have a fear or a recognition that that was quite an instrumentalizing approach to faith engagement in the initial element of the initial time period of the response. But overall, this reflection of incredibly uneven engagement that's happening across different countries and experiences. And each group is defined by the parameters of their country. The politicization of some of the public health issues was also clear, and the intricacies around framing this as debates connected to religious freedom and re-emphasizing the ability to reaffirm the rights of religious freedom for all also came up as part of this. Without getting into a whole nother debate around that, I will, if you'll excuse me, I know I'm probably running out of time, move on to what we saw as some of the recommendations. Now, a big area that I haven't discussed yet is vaccination. And we really saw that there was a call amongst participants for recognizing vaccination, a public good vaccine, as someone mentioned. So the questions come up around who gets it, when, and how. We recognize that vaccine testing and distribution over time and in previous examples has been really affected by the, again, inequities in society, and that there is a lot of mistrust that potentially already exists. But also we heard some statements affirming that, religious communities that have been categorized as anti-vaccination might not be so strongly anti-vaccination as it seems, and that they've been portrayed. And so there really is the ability to still work in environments that may seem extremely anti-vaccine, actually to work with communities and work with religious leaders to increase awareness there. And we've also heard about disruption of logistics for medications and how that might impact vaccination. And remember that this can also be linked to elements of disruption around food security as well for people, and that hunger has been a big part of how faith communities are responding. But the logistics element of vaccination, food, some of these essential things that are going to be coming up has been an issue. So religious leaders, people within leadership positions, people who are trusted within religious communities are going to be crucial in awareness around vaccination in the coming months. And if governments recognize and engage consistently and meaningfully with faith actors, there can be a good and positive interaction going forward. Of course, it's an if. So the intersection of government engagement and vaccination kind of came up as potentially an area of debate and interest going forward. So demonstrating the benefit and worth of engaging with religious communities, particularly those who are underrepresented and marginalized, for vaccination as a specific issue, but all these other social services we've seen is going to be an area of particular import going forward. I'm sure I'm over my time, so I'm going to stop there. Thanks, Kath.
Unfortunately, we don't have much time, but you give us a taste of the richness of the discussion and of the ideas. Let me turn now to Ganoun Diop, who's leading a continuing working group, but who also led the discussion yesterday on the enormously important and complex issues around race.
and mute myself. Are you hearing me now? Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. I would like to, if I were to give a title to these concluding remarks relating to race and racism, I will entitle it One Humanity, One Human Family. The overarching, undergirding, and even root cause of the predicament of racism is the stubborn refusal to embrace the reality of one humanity, actually one human race. The concept of one humanity in all solidarity and justice is found in most religious traditions. However, adherents to these religious traditions struggle to embody this deep common humanity and ancestry, actually, in how to relate to others who are different or who believe differently. The international community has rallied around key principles expressed as the three pillars of the United Nations: peace and security, justice and development, and human rights. The latter being subdivided actually into three pillars: individual liberty, personal equality, and life in dignity. There seems to be a consensus, at least at a theoretical level. The challenges of personal equality and justice and equity are today brought to the fore because of the scourge of racism. Now, in this concluding session, I would like to focus on the way forward towards a post-racial global order. It may at times sound aspirational, but as an old wise person intimated, I quote from the book of Proverbs, "Without a vision, people perish." I mentioned earlier that, during the week, that the problems, the evil, and the sin of racism are multifaceted. So must be the solutions. The abolition or end of racism can only be achieved and its toxic, nefarious, and harmful effects neutralized or mitigated when addressed from comprehensive perspectives. So at systemic and structural levels, laws in place to perpetuate racism must be changed and rulings to make racism unlawful put in place. The fossilized systems of domination and economic control established since colonial times must be dismantled and reconfigured in all equity. It may be also that new amendments to constitutions may be one of the best ways to design a new trajectory in human consciousness about the necessity to welcome and embrace the dignity of every human person. Institutional structures geared towards maintaining the injustices of discrimination, the restriction to having access to goods, to jobs, housing, to position, or simply to decent living must be reformed. Now, of course, this will necessitate a further mobilization, and as I mentioned during the week, beyond the streets to chambers of law, of lawmakers rather, to restore equity and fairness. To help in the process and show genuine concern and goodwill to better human relations, one of the recommendations to the G20 decision makers could be the urgency to establish commissions, independent review mechanisms towards dismantling racism in all its forms, in all governmental institutions and agencies. But not only governments, international institutions and organizations also will have a work of restoration to initiate. This work will also include the establishment of review mechanisms, commissions, mandated to identify racial injustices and propose plans of action toward more justice. After all, we do have a ratified international convention specifically addressing the need to uproot racism from our institutions, structures, and personal relations. Suffice it here to mention the International Covenant for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And I just, again, read very briefly to remind us what was agreed upon. I quote, "Considering that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaimed that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set out therein, without distinction of any kind, in particular as to race, color, or national origin. Considering that the United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination solemnly affirmed the necessity of speedily eliminating racial discrimination throughout the world in all its forms and manifestations, and of securing understanding of and respect for the dignity of the human person, convinced that any doctrine of superiority based on racial differentiation is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust, and dangerous, and that there is no justification for racial discrimination in theory or in practice anywhere, unquote. So, at a religious level also, faith must overcome the worst of religions. Religions bring to the community of peoples from all nations lofty ideals that can be helpful. However, they are often contradicted or stifled because of quests for power, dominion, control, again, and overall by human greed. Persons and corporations would not relinquish before any means to choose profit of a people. Thus, the justification of slavery that we talked about during this week, even as a divinely endorsed practice. In one religious system, the so-called curse of Ham, the consideration of Black people as inferior or as property. And in another system, in particular casteism, the stratification of society into varnas, caste, and in particular at the lower bottom, in fact, beyond classification are the Dalit, untouchable, those destined to be deprived of any semblance of upward mobility. So religious people at their best embody transcendental principles and values. An illustration could be briefly found in several religious traditions with the difference between justice on the one hand and righteousness. This is underlined in each monotheistic religion. This righteousness actually goes beyond justice, as shown, for example, in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers. The healing of our world from various historical transgenerational traumas can benefit from genuine embrace of righteousness, the highest value in religious consciousness. It is, in fact, inseparable from love, as was mentioned at the opening session on Monday. So the healing of the wound of human existence and relations is an urgent task. At personal level, it can take, of course, and that was mentioned also, the path of the regenerations of heart and minds. As mentioned, racism shows certainly in societal structural levels, at institutional levels, but it also has some insidious path through patronizing practices, paternalistic or maternalistic infantilizing attitudes towards Black people or so-called people of color. Conscious or unconscious biases based on the assumption of Black people lacking maturity or competence to lead, to manage, or to assume positions of authority. These also have prevented the international community to really benefit from peaceful coexistence. It could be that our world may need to embrace the true sense of the word authority, which is from the Latin word augere, to cause others to be fruitful. A recommendation, and taking in stock here the conversation we had yesterday, and then also the presentations before. Concretely, the G20 Interfaith Initiative on anti-racism is coming up with a statement, and that was mentioned, a statement on anti-racism, which Ambassador Jim Christie has graciously provided us with an initial draft. This draft lays the foundation of the moral motivation of the participants in the G20 Interfaith Forum's commitment to connect faith and policies for the benefit of all people anywhere, and especially the victims of global greed. Another approach would be to provide a wish list, prioritizing the immediate end of suffering of victims of racism, with the aim of drafting policies to effect change towards a more human and humane world. One would be one of those recommendations to end the violence against Black people, the stigmatization and brutality in the hands of police and the self-appointed vigilantes. These should be seen as unlawful. Two, to affirm and to protect the dignity of every human being, to adopt in all places, among all people groups, the true humanization of our world through genuine act of solidarity with the whole human family. To embrace, number three here, a more pluralistic social configuration and a multicultural democracy, yes. Four, to repudiate the legacy and traces of colonial, constitutional, institutional, and structural racism and to enact laws against Afrophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, anti-Asian sentiments, and homophobia. Five, to deconstruct the myth of the inferiority of Black people, the alleged curses that would justify their enslavement, subjugation, submission, and unfair exploitations of the resources of the African continent. Six, to review our constitutions and laws to make sure racism is no longer embedded in them. Seven, to promote racial equality as justice reflected in economic and sociocultural communal life. To reverse the plight of the poor, most of whom are disenfranchised because of the color of their skin, through creative actually empowerment and opportunities to decent living. Black, by and large, have low paid jobs, lower income, and indecent housing due to centuries of discriminations that have led to racial disparities. To educate people, and that's number 9, against cultural insensitivity, and to promote respect of the dignity of difference. 10, to put in place creative plans of actions geared towards the healing of transgenerational trauma. The experiences of slavery, segregation, and disproportionate mass incarceration of African American, for example, compared to other ethnic groups, require deliberate actions to revert the plight and predicament of these overall underprivileged minority. Then number 11, and I have 12 of these, then 2 more, to review policies to align them with principles and values consonant with equality, freedom, and human solidarity, fraternity in that sense. 12, to stop the scapegoating of Black people and implying that the fault lies with them, and ending rhetoric that promotes the following faulty view: things will be better if they behave and improve their station. So to better the condition of living of the whole human family in peaceful coexistence, in all equity and equality before the law, and before the sanctity of every person's life, deliberate personal and corporate endeavors are needed today. It could be that when religious actors and people rediscover what it means that human beings are sacred, more important than holy sites, more important than holy places. In fact, humans are called temples of the Holy Spirit. Every person is a mystery beyond just being a biological being. Human conscience, and here I join Cole for bringing the idea of religious freedom in the conversation. Human conscience, the inner sanctuary in each person, should never be violated. Disregarding a person's freedom of conscience is in fact denying that person's humanity and uniqueness. When reconciliation and genuine lifestyle of hospitality is embraced, and my friend was mentioning that yesterday, when hospitality is genuinely adopted and practiced, racism will have no tolerated space in our relations to one another. Lawmakers can then join to help enact laws to protect the dignity of every person in all respect of the sanctity of every person's life. May the conversation, Catherine, continue, and the partnership and the work continue until we reach a better place and space where sacrificial love, as Audrey reminded us the first day, where sacrificial love becomes the atmosphere we bask in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ganoon, and thank you, all of you, for your very thoughtful and thought-provoking comments. There's very little time left. So in the few minutes that are left, I have a very few comments of my own, but also I think it's important to give a clear idea of where we will be going next. There are some questions in the Q&A which we will not have time to address as we're coming close to the end, but we will very much keep them in mind and address them as we move forward. Just a few comments. General Dallaire, in his moving keynote address, told the story of a child during the Rwanda genocide, a child who appeared out of nowhere in a no man's zone, suffering in every way. But he also reminded us that looking into that child's eyes, he saw the same spirit, the same potential that he saw in his own grandson. And I think that this is, in a way, the most common theme that we have heard echoed time and time again during this week, which is this sense of humanity and what it means to be human. And behind that, something that the COVID pandemic has showed so starkly, which is the real implications, the realities of inequalities in the world and inequities. Inequity points us more to the raw unfairness of different access to health systems, to the challenges that come with vaccination. So I think that these issues of humanity, equity, and inequality are ones that run through all of the discussions that we've had. A few others that are a bit more practical. The relationships between religious bodies and governments have been highlighted during the COVID crisis, but they're also highlighted by the refugee issue and, as we've heard now, by the race challenges. These relationships need to be worked out country by country. There are also efforts that include the G20 Interfaith Forum to bring the networks of networks together to be at the table. Because as we so often say, if you're not at the table, you end up on the menu. You're the subject and not a participant. So this question of the relationships, whether it's religious freedom, the implications of human rights, the education strategies, finding ways to reach those who are left behind, to deal with minorities that are persecuted, to deal with the dangers of scapegoating and discrimination, which we're seeing in different parts of the world. So I think that the discussions here have led us to focus in many different ways on these relationships between governments and religious bodies of many kinds. A third issue that I think was pointed out is that one of our objectives as the Interfaith Forum, apart from responding in pragmatic, often incremental ways, is to highlight the prophetic voice, as we call it, looking to the future. And we've heard so often that build back the same is completely unsatisfactory, that build back better is fine, but not fully reflective of the challenge, that we really need, as we're challenged now, to look beyond the norms, beyond the simple reforms and traditions into something much broader. So I have a lot more ideas. I'm so much struck by the wonderful discussions we've had this week. So simply to summarize, we will have the recording of this session as well as of the first session available on the website. We're preparing an event summary that will be a document that will also be on the website. But perhaps even more, we will be looking to the lengthy discussions that we've had and the side discussions and the chat and the questions to something that will help us to formulate more detailed briefs that will contribute to the process of coming up with recommendations that will be presented first to the Interfaith Forum discussion, which will be in October, as Cole said, from the 13th to the 17th, and that will find their way also in different ways to the G20 leaders, including the ministerials, the other engagement groups, and remember that they are focusing very much on the November meeting. We also are looking very much to the 2021 G20 chaired by Italy. And there, I think one of the underlying themes that we take is that the G20 was established primarily to deal with economic matters. And clearly this year, issues of debt, of social protection will be very prominent in the discussions, as well as the vaccine issue. But as we look forward, we see the vital importance of the social issues, so many: education, universal health coverage, all of the other basic issues that go with human dignity. And those are the issues that we will commit ourselves to look towards as we move forward. So with that, I just offer my thanks to all of you and look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you.